So, one thing that has apparently been a major issue lately is that many suburban neighborhoods across the United States and potentially in other countries, but I've specifically heard of this in the case of California, where many suburban neighborhoods are falsely designating themselves as historic, like designating the houses and the neighborhood as a whole as being historic in an effort to prevent new construction. So they're against like condominiums, apartments, townhouses, any kind of densification or any kind of new buildings. So they falsely designate themselves as historic in order to get around this. Now, this is really bad for numerous reasons. Number one, it exacerbates suburban sprawl. And number two, it threatens actual historic neighborhoods. And I mean, the exacerbation of suburban sprawl is pretty obvious. Like, that's their goal, to maintain the so-called character of their neighborhood, which nearly always in the case of these neighborhoods means like low density suburban sprawl. And these are post World War II neighborhoods, generally speaking. But the reason why it potentially hurts actual historic neighborhoods is that it will create a sense of preservation fatigue. Essentially, when everything is historic, then nothing is. And when these people abuse the definition of historic architecture and abuse historic preservation laws to try to falsely protect buildings that aren't truly historic in any way, shape, or form, they make people more apathetic and even hostile toward the idea of preserving actual historic architecture. Now, I suppose this does raise the question, how do you define historic architecture? Like, granted, certain people try to define historic architecture according to their political ideology, and I think you can't be 100% neutral. Like, I'm not saying I'm not being ideological at all here with my definition. Like, I don't aspire to be neutral. I don't think neutrality is a good thing. But I'm saying even still, okay, if you're trying to make a neutral definition, most would agree that like historic architecture has to do with how old it is. And these buildings do not make the cut in that regard. Like, they're not even like close to 100 years old. They're like at most like, I don't know, 60, 65, or maybe, okay, like 1950 was like what? 75 years ago. So at most they're like, wait a sec. Yes, 75 years ago. It was 1950. So at most, they're 75 years old, give or take, in the vast majority of cases. A few of these might be older than 1950, but probably not too many of them. So they're not even that old. But, I mean, putting that aside, it's like, okay, obviously there's a lot of liberals and leftists, like especially like radical leftists, who just hate traditional architecture because some of these people are like unironic communists and they believe in this idea of like, oh, old is bad, new is good. We must dispense with the olds and bring in the new. And I think there are some leftists who they try to either do away with historic preservation laws entirely, or they want to redefine it. So like the only things that are considered historic is like if something important happened there. And even then, it's usually if something important related to the leftist narrative of history. So like, oh, if Frederick Douglass lived in this house, or if Rosa Parks took a shit in this bathroom or whatever. Like, that's generally what they mean by historic. But most people, generally speaking, most people, and also the general legal definition of historic usually applies more toward things like not only historic events, but also architectural styles and when something was built. And that's something, again, a lot of these anti-historic aesthetics people, they think that like, oh, either these laws should be done away with or it should only apply to like major events or whatever. But it's like most people would generally agree that it has to do with architectural styles and also with how old it is. So by those two definitions, these suburban neighborhoods would fail because they're not old enough and they're not really distinctive architectural styles or historic traditional architectural styles. They are modernist post-World War II styles. Now, personally, this is where my own ideology comes in, but personally, I don't think modernist stuff deserves to be preserved. I think it's crap, it's ugly. It doesn't merit preservation. And I think most people would agree who are advocates of historical preservation, because generally speaking, historical preservation is driven by an aesthetic preference for historical architecture, like traditional forms of architecture. And most people who believe in that don't really give a shit about the preservation of like ugly 1950s, 60s, 70s modernist buildings. Now, again, like there's differing opinions on that. And frankly, some opinions are worth more than others, in my opinion, which is one that I think is worth more than those of these modernists. And again, like, frankly, because I think beauty is an important intrinsic value and modernists go against that. So I don't give a shit about the preservation of their brutalist crap from the 50s and 60s or even earlier. Frankly, let it be torn down. But okay, for argument's sake, it's like, okay, if we want to have a quick and easy definition of historic architecture, for simplicity's sake, I would be fine with, like, let's say anything before X year, even if it meant that a few ugly modernist buildings would make the cut and would technically be deemed historic. It'd be like, okay, but the vast majority would not. So let's say, for instance, if you made that year 1945, or if you made it 1939, or if you made it 1930, then the vast majority of ugly modernist buildings would not make the cut, but a few would. Because there was some modernist and proto-modernist architecture popping up even as early as like the 1870s, but really it started taking off in the 20th century. But I would say even as late as like the 1910s or 20s, the majority of the architecture was still what we'd call traditional styles. So again, where exactly to draw the line? I would personally say between 1930 and 1945 somewhere. The problem is the earlier you go, the more actual architecture value you risk being destroyed. But the later you go and the more crap risks going through, like being sifted through and potentially giving people preservation fatigue because of all the crap they're being forced to preserve. Like technically Eminem's birth house was built in 1945. That ugly ass house was burned down, the firebombing of Dresden, so to speak. Like literally on Dresden Street in 1945. That was a major missed opportunity. Eminem really should have written a song or an album called The Firebombing of Dresden regarding his former house. But yeah, my point is that ugly ass house and many houses like it were technically built in 1945 or earlier. So there'd be a lot of crap that would pass through that way. So maybe, I don't know. I don't know what would be the exact best year to draw the line, but I would say probably somewhere between 1930 and 1945. The problem with a law that's like, let's say you tried to make a law to make it so like something before then wouldn't have to be preserved because it's modernist. Like there'd be some like Le Corbusier and early modernist stuff that would be before 1930. The problem with that would be making the definition more subjective would inherently potentially open it up to like people whose agenda is to destroy actual traditional architecture, being like, well, like, oh, this Art Deco stuff, this Art Nouveau stuff, it's not that historic. So it's like maybe it's better to have a more inclusive definition for that reason. I mean, and also there's the question of like, okay, there's a few post-World War II buildings that might merit preservation, like especially some reconstructions of old buildings, although reconstructions vary heavily. Some of them are absolute crap and do not deserve to be preserved. Some do. Furthermore, there's stuff that was started before World War II and ended after, or still hasn't been ended, like in the case of the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona or Stone Mountain in Georgia. So, and there's also the case of like you have the rare case of entirely new buildings that are well done, like Poundbury, Leon Creer's Poundbury town in the UK. So it's like there could be exceptions made, but I think they would have to be exceptions and not the rule, because we don't want preservation fatigue. That's a big problem. And that's, again, like relating it back to these suburban houses. Like, these are a case, it's not even a gray area. Like, some cases would be gray areas, like the ones that I've mentioned, like modernist buildings before a certain date, or like traditional style buildings after a certain date. Those would both be gray areas, but for different reasons, according to historic preservation laws, but like real or hypothetical laws. But I'm saying that, like, these suburban things, like these suburban neighborhoods in California and places like that, those should not even be considered a gray area. They're not in a traditional style. And I think for the most part, they weren't built before World War II. They're post-World War II homes. So they don't meet either definition in terms of age or in terms of style. These are not historic buildings. They're not traditional style. They're just suburban crap. And it risks preservation fatigue. It risks essentially making the entire idea of historic preservation meaningless by overloading it with crap that doesn't apply. And I'm sure these suburbanites in these neighborhoods know full well that it doesn't apply, and they're just being completely cynical with it to get what they want. So they're jeopardizing the preservation of actual historic neighborhoods by making the entire definition of historic architecture or historic preservation meaningless. So this is yet another way that suburbanites hurt traditional architecture on top of the many other ways they do. And it needs to be stopped. People need to just say, no, this crap is not historic, it's not traditional. And again, sure, there's some low density suburbs of sorts that did exist before World War II. But the vast majority, to my understanding, these neighborhoods in California, that's not even what they are. They're post-World War II suburbs built in modernist styles, or like kitschy post-war styles, like not actual traditional architecture by any definition. And sure, like maybe a neighborhood like Rosedale in Toronto would fall, like some of these houses would fall into a gray area because they're suburban level density, but they are technically pre-World War II and in pre-war styles. So like those might fall into a gray area, whereas like a lot of these houses in these California neighborhoods, that's not what they are. They're just post-war suburbs, and it's complete bullshit. And I'm sure this is happening across the US, but California is where apparently it's more prominent, or at least more newsworthy, because these debates in California are very frequent due to the fact that California's had more attempts to densify suburban neighborhoods than in other parts of the country. Like, I would say California, but also maybe to an extent in Washington and Oregon. I think maybe a little bit in Minneapolis, Denver. I'm not sure entirely where this has been happening, but I think California is ground zero of these debates. And yeah, it just needs to be said that people should not be abusing the definition of historic architecture for cynical ends.